All right, welcome to session 27 of Classic Metal Class. We've got Scott Tarulli here, as always, my co-host from Berklee School of Music, a touring musician, so he's going to have a lot of stuff to contribute, particularly in, we could say, the technical modality when we come to some of these bands and topics. And what we're looking at today has to do with classification, what counts as heavy metal. And we're not going to, of course, solve it with a nice catch-all definition, but something that both of us encountered back in the 80s, and it's continuing on to today, is a puzzle. There are bands and musicians that were considered heavy metal that would say, we're not a heavy metal band, or I'm not a heavy metal musician. And, I'll let Scott jump in just a second with some of his own experiences with this. But one of the things that struck me when I was a kid, reading Circus magazine, I remember they'd always have, like one band featured on the cover with like a quip or something. And one time it was AC/DC, and they were saying, we're not a heavy metal band. And I thought at the time, well, that's kind of weird because we think of them as heavy metal, but I think that the understanding of it was a little bit more loose back then. And we can actually make a solid argument for AC/DC not actually being a heavy metal band and that being a correct statement. There's certainly a blues-based hard rock band that a lot of people who were into heavy metal would listen to and would go to shows for. And oftentimes they would tour with a heavy metal band, and they got into heavy metal rotation. So if they did a video, it could be in Headbangers Ball in MTV, or if there was like a metal hour, they might play Hell's Bells or something like that. So, if you're some 14-year-old kid who doesn't know any better, right? Why wouldn't you think that they were a heavy metal band? And so there was also some room for controversy. We dug up some things. In 1983, Rolling Stone had an encyclopedia entry that began Australian heavy metal band AC/DC. So it wasn't just us dumb kids, it was reputable music sources that were willing to say that. This rock historian, Clinton Walker, said calling AC/DC a heavy metal band in the 70s was inaccurate as it is today. They were a rock and roll band that just happened to be heavy enough for metal. And I think that's kind of a cool distinction there. And then this other person, Ian Christie, said that AC/DC became the stepping stone that led huge numbers of hard rock fans into heavy metal perdition, which is not saying they're heavy metal, but they're like a gateway drug. So now, Scott, you and I have talked about AC/DC before, and what the sound is, and that you could say the guitar sound is certainly different in its technical arrangements than what would normally be found in heavy metal. But I mean, did you when you were a kid, did you think that AC/DC was heavy metal or not?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the first AC/DC album I bought was Back in Black, and
Yeah.
that was a heavy metal album to me. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, I got it soon after it came out, like a couple of years or something. But it was cool to have that album at the time. That was like the cool album to have. But yeah, I mean, um, yeah, I didn't think of them as rock and roll. That was like metal,
Yeah.
I remember, I'll never forget one of my teachers in school. He wanted to have this listening club, right? And I was in fifth grade. So after school, he would say anybody can bring music in to listen to, right? And and we would talk about it. And I don't think it went the way he wanted. I brought in a Blue Oyster Cult song, I think Cities on Flame, right?
Okay.
And he said, well, wouldn't you want to listen to something that you could whistle to, you know? And then I said, like, when I got this AC/DC album, he goes, isn't that the band that just makes noise? I'll never forget that. Like, and that's pretty metal. Like, for an adult to say they just make noise. At that time, if you said rock and roll, you could mean Elvis Presley,
Right. Or the
So, or the
Beatles. Yeah.
Beatles, yeah. And so, but like, you definitely wouldn't like. call Peter Frampton metal,
Yeah.
but that was a whole different, thing. But yeah, looking back, absolutely kind of a rootsy rock and roll band.
So something that you and I have talked about quite a lot, in other conversations is where does AC/DC get the heaviness? You can definitely call them a heavy band. Where does that sound come from technically? And I mean, you've got a pretty well worked out take on that.
Yeah.
So,
So um the guitarist played Gibson SGs, and I'm saying that because it's a Gibson guitar with the humbuckers. The humbuckers is like a fatter sound, except SGs are known for their mid-range, a lot more
okay.
mid-range. As opposed to a Les Paul, which is a Gibson with the same pickups in it. It's because of the body, weight and everything, or the SGs are much thinner. And that was an important part of the sound because they're very much more mid-rangey guitars with fat pickups, fat sounding pickups through old Marshall JTM 45s. And I just say that because the way to get gain on those was just to turn the volume up, pushing the tubes in distress, which also gave you kind of this mid-range, not like a little hair on the chords and the notes, not necessarily distortion.
Not
So
not even completely overdrive, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So if you like listen to the beginning of You Shook Me All Night Long, and the guitars up front, that's next to clean. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
pull it up and listen to it. But when the bass comes in, the bass is full and occupying the frequencies that the guitar might on its own sound a little empty, but with the bass and the guitar filling in those frequencies, it's a very big sound.
Yeah, yeah.
Like everybody still gets AC/DC wrong. I still see people that they just put on tons of distortion because in their mind, this is really heavy, so I should put on lots of distortion. When in fact, they, they didn't use distortion per se. You heard that it was an SG, meaning if you know the sound, you knew what guitar that they were playing because the mids were there, and you didn't, nothing affected the integrity of the sound of it.
Okay.
You have this great pleasing tone, and you have this wonderful, the tone of the bass is the hero, to that sound. But yeah, You Shook Me. Everybody should go back and listen to
That's
that.
that's interesting because I've seen interviews with Cliff Williams and nobody, when they're like singling out great even hard rock bassists, he's never included in the list, in part because he's mostly playing the root note and it's, like eighth notes or quarter notes or something like that. He doesn't do a lot of fills. So he's not like a bass hero, like say Steve Harris would be, up at the top, or, people doing innovative stuff like Lemmy, playing the bass almost as if it's a rhythm guitar. And, he'd get asked about that and he'd say, listen, I'm just doing what's actually needed for the songs. I don't need to be fancy or flashy. Sometimes just a straight ahead, just keeping the time with the drums, but giving that root note for the riff is exactly what you need.
It is, and it's funny you say that because the same with Malcolm Young for years,
Oh
the
yeah, yeah,
um and finally it started coming out that he was extremely important, even though he didn't play any lead guitar. And
yeah.
you know, unbelievable rock rhythm player. And I don't mean just his time is great, but the way he hits the strings. You have to remember with the guitar tone they're using, a slight mess up is going to be loud, as opposed to if you drench your guitar sound in too much gain and effects, whether you hit the chord hard or you hit it soft, it's pretty much going to come out the same way.
Okay.
Um, so back then it was a while till publicly. I mean, people love Malcolm, but like I started seeing it written about where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, Malcolm Young, like, the band wouldn't be the band without that rhythm guitar. And it is true. I agree.
And he did a lot of the songwriting too. He's
He-
sort of like Rudolf Schenkner in that way. a real
Yeah.
center to things. So with coming back to the topic, so I'm fine with saying, okay, we were deluded as kids. They aren't really heavy
Right.
metal. And, they were on point when they were saying in the 80s, we're not a heavy metal band, but we've used this category before of metal adjacent, where, if it was in the same like tape or CD collection or record collection with the metal albums, even if it wasn't technically metal, we're willing to say, yeah, it's kind of like that. Um, would you revise that in the present with what you know now, as
Uh,
opposed to little Scott in the 1980s?
well, it's funny you say metal adjacent because I'll give a great example. Like you've over the decades, you've been to a lot of heavy shows, metal
Right.
bands, metal, and what I noticed was a common thread with most of the metal shows is you knew when AC/DC's A Long Way to the Top came on through the PA speakers that the band was going to come on,
Yes.
right? And so, I've been to an Iron Maiden show where that, but like a lot, what's weird is that would be even before more of a pop rock thing. It was like,
Okay.
so that it's metal adjacent, but like you wouldn't play an Iron Maiden song, say, before Heart gets on stage, right? Or
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, I'm thinking like, so Iron Maiden, typically nowadays it'll be Lights Out
right,
is the song right before. And arguably that's a metal song. There's debates about is UFO metal or not, and I'm willing to say, sort of like I would do with Uriah Heep, okay, they will call them a metal band, but a lot of the stuff they play isn't metal. Sometimes
right.
they're just doing hard rock. But like with Judas Priest, it's War Pigs that comes on. So definitely metal. You're definitely getting metal, right? Um, and I don't know who else gets typically used with that regularity. Where if you go to an Iron Maiden show, it's going to be
Yeah, like
lights out.
because Steve Harris is a huge Pete
Steve
Wade
Way fan, yeah,
fan.
yeah.
And interesting because this is a great example. I've talked to you about this. I saw the Somewhere in Time tour in Boston. It was like 86, right? 87
Yeah,
maybe. And they brought in Pete Way's current band, which was called Way.
wasted. Yeah,
And what's interesting is the album they were touring sounded more like a Survivor album. And it was like good pop, great pop, and
yeah,
uh I had the record and it like they had the metal look, right? They had like the hair and the spandex and all that. But I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing Steve Harris, you know, asked Pete Way to bring his band,
yeah,
and of course I listened to earlier Wasted stuff, which was heavier, but they were premiering their new album, which now I really respect them for. But it's like Survivor being up there with like their rock kind of stuff, with their melodic rock. And I'll
yeah,
never forget, the place was erupting in booze, you know, and I kind of was excited to hear them because I knew all the songs on the new album.
yeah.
They sounded fantastic live, and I was like, I was afraid to cheer because I didn't want to get it beat up. But you know, that's interesting because they had the look, they did have the loud guitars, heavy guitar riffs, but with a melodic singer. So those two did not go together, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but I think AC/DC would survive as an opening act for Maiden. I don't
Oh,
know.
yeah.
You know
I
what I
mean,
mean?
I can't think of a fan base. Well, maybe in some of the more extreme metal, they'd be like, what are you doing bringing,
Oh, right.
some
Yeah.
some newer, big death metal band. They'd be like, what the hell's AC/DC doing here? But yeah,
Right.
anything that's kind of in the mainstream, I would, and rooted in classics, 70s, 80s, maybe even early 90s metal. Why wouldn't you want AC/DC? I mean, it would be surprising to see AC/DC open for anybody,
Right.
even by the 80s with the stature that they had.
Oh, you know what? Another test we never thought about is it's funny, they had the Monsters of Rock, right?
Right.
But it wasn't Monsters of Metal. But
That's right. Yeah.
it had Dawkins, it had Van Halen, Dio, right?
Yep.
So it kind of had, I guess you could look at the bill on that and go, okay, these bands all kind of go together, even though some are metal and some are rock and roll. I guess maybe we'd all agree that they're heavy, but
Well, and that's a good lead into something else. So another reason for doing this session was a couple months back, Uli Jon Roth. So, for those who don't know him, the not original guitarist for the Scorpions, but let's say the guitarist for the Scorpions' first really, really good age, because before it was Michael Schenkner, who goes on to UFO and then his own fame. But that early Scorpions period of Fly to the Rainbow all the way to Taken by Force, he's the lead guitarist, and he's very influenced by Jimi Hendrix, who arguably is proto metal. And so he gave this interview in Brave Words in 2023, and it was the sort of tagline is, "I'm not a fan of heavy metal, never have been one. It doesn't speak to me." And he said, there would be no heavy metal without bands like Cream and Led Zeppelin up front, but these were completely different from what metal is. And here's, I think, a key term: nowadays. And
yeah,
now here's where it got kind of interesting. They were a lot more daring. They were a lot more dangerous in the true sense of the word, because all that stuff had never been done before. It felt that way. And then he said, now the metal of the 80s and 90s became more corporate. They used more aggression, louder, faster, thinking this would make it more dangerous. But to me, it isn't. These other elements are more in the field of being creative and coming up with something really new. So metal didn't really bring that much new. I felt it was, in a way, a step back. Now that's kind of interesting that, this is a blanket statement about, and it's not just like, yeah, the new kids today in the 2000s. He's saying even in the 80s,
right.
you know, metal was not that good, And so he says, oh, go ahead, Scott.
I just wanted to be on this point. Uh, he seems to be talking when he says it was, heavier, faster, louder. That wasn't the corporate stuff, though. Wasn't the
Right.
corporate Whitesnake and Dawkins, under lock and key, their $10,000 suits, like
Yeah. What we
uh,
often called pop metal back then, or
right.
metal light, or yeah.
Yeah, but like I'm thinking, when Metallica was coming up, they weren't corporate at all. They were just angry 18-year-olds, and they were kind
Yeah.
of underground, like the first few albums that I think a lot of us liked the most. I mean, they became corporate maybe when with the Black album,
Yeah.
but prior to then, I wouldn't call the heavy like Anthrax. I don't think they were corporate.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. Or even, the whole gamut of what we called speed metal back then that eventually morphed into
Right.
thrash, and it was pretty loose too, whatever counted. I mean, even some of the other things that don't completely fit into that, like, is Venom corporate? I don't think so, because
That's it.
no corporation was going to hire them for an event, or, to be the face of Pepsi or something like that.
That's it. Yeah, and you and I remember the underground stuff. You go over to a friend's house and they'd have one of these records.
Yeah.
And it was like you didn't hear it on the radio, you heard it from your friends.
Or it would be a tape of a tape of a
Of a
tape,
tape. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And well, odd thing, just a side note, is even if I got a tape of something, I still had to have my own copy. I was
You mean a
still like,
record?
I still, yeah, I eventually get
Yeah.
the physical copy because, all the pictures and and it sounded better and, you wanted to be part of it. But
Sometimes it'd be tough to get, though,
that's it.
depending on where you lived. Although interesting, I mean, there's total trivia, right? In the back of those magazines like Circus or Hit Parader, there would be these ads for getting the records, and sometimes even like posters or t-shirts that you couldn't find in your local record store.
Yes. Yep. That and, funny enough, because I got Guitar Player magazine, they would have like, Steve Stevens would do an album that wasn't going to be distributed or somebody.
Oh,
And so you would cut out the coupon, right? And then you'd put it in an envelope with a check.
Yeah.
We'd send it off, and like weeks later, the CD would come in the mail or whatever, and but it's kind of, yeah, that's right. In some of those magazines that were kind of specialized, like, if you read Hit Parade, you were more apt to, but like, yeah, that's where you'd find some of the, you can't find this, but we'll send it to you because we have access to it. I mean,
Yeah.
that was the best.
So going ahead with this, one of the things that he said that was, stuff that he said first, okay, it kind of makes sense. And then he says, then again, what is metal? If I speak to Bruce Dickinson, for instance, and we had this discussion once, I said, you're not really metal. You're a hard rock band. And he completely agrees, because Maiden is still old school and they play with dynamics. They play distorted, but they have this old school kind of organic touch, this organic feel, which you can touch with your hands almost. Metal always has an abrasive edge that I don't like. And, when I read that, I'm like, Bruce Dickinson said that Iron Maiden wasn't heavy metal. I would have loved to have like sat in on that conversation because I can't picture it actually happening. And I don't want to say that Uli Jon Roth is a liar,
Right.
but what's going on there? Is it some weird idea of what counts as metal that,
It could have been isolated. He could have, kind of cherry picked from the conversation too.
yeah,
Um, it's, Bruce might have said, "Oh, you have a point because some of this stuff, like, it does have this." However, but like he could have left the however out, because it's funny, the old interview of Ozzy in the mid '80s. They ask him who's the greatest metal band, and he goes, "Me," and he goes, "No, I'm just kidding." He goes, "Iron Maiden," and
oh,
like
interesting.
Ozzy said, like, Iron Maiden, and then they went through this
Yeah.
of asking him. They go, and it was so funny because they go, "What do you think of Thriller?" He goes, "Boring." And then they go, "Michael Jackson, boring." And then they go the Thriller video. He goes, "Okay." Right. And then they said, "Boy George," and he goes, "Fantastic, fantastic, love Boy George." And then Def Leppard, he goes, "Amazing, amazing."
Interesting.
I know. And then the Beatles, and he got like really emotional. He goes, "The Beatles are everything." It was like such an interesting thing to see Ozzy. Like, we would have never thought, we would have thought he would have hated everything that was not metal. And then that's when they ask him who's the best metal band. And he
Okay.
goes, "Me." And he goes, "No," he goes, "Probably Iron Maiden." And that was really cool. I mean, that would have been around the time of Power Slave,
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
so
So
um
1984, 1985.
exactly.
Yeah.
And for Ozzy, uh, because of the history in the music, and he thought of him as a metal band. I guess is part of my point, is
Yeah.
that Ozzy, when you say metal to Ozzy, he's gonna say Maiden, or he could have said Judas Priest. I think that would, and we're
Yep.
talking about somebody that came from that era, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like some new kid. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. I wasn't surprised when he said it, but then when you sent then like when we started reading some of these quotes, rather,
From
um,
Uli Jon Roth.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of like, like, I don't know if I totally agree to the, you know, uh, I know I
Yeah.
was trying to say.
So what's your reaction? So this is another thing from Guitar World in 2023. And he's asked, what led to your decision to leave the Scorpions, which opened up room later for Matthias Jobs to come in, which takes the Scorpions in a somewhat different direction. So he said, my mind was full of music that was unsuitable for the Scorpions. I wanted to do new things, didn't believe the other band members would be into it, so I didn't even bring it to the table. We had established a direction that was very early hard rock and heavy metal. And even though I'd helped create it, I no longer felt close to it. For me, the heavy metal direction was boring. I wasn't keen on it. I wasn't interested in it. I wanted to go in almost the opposite direction, but that wasn't fashionable then because the spirit of the time was metal driven by the mindset of the audience, big record companies, MTV, and the general public. Now, MTV isn't out when he leaves the Scorpions
Right.
yet. So maybe he's kind of retrospectively talking about that. Um, but there was, like a big resurgence of metal that's already happening by 79 when he's leaving. So on the one hand, he's saying, hey, the stuff I did with the Scorpions with me as lead is heavy metal. And then he's also saying, I didn't want to do that sort of stuff anymore.
Right.
So what is he saying the Scorpions are definitely a heavy metal band, but he doesn't like that? Or
Yeah, right. I think, well, I think the basis is, I think maybe in comparison to what he was hearing in his head. Now it's interesting. He said he didn't
okay.
even bring it to the table, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't really shot down by the band, which is kind of an interesting thought, right?
Yeah.
What if he brought it and they said, we love it, because, the solo records, although what's the one, the first Uli album I got sounded like like, like almost like a theater production,
Okay.
it was, it was heavy, but it was like a very almost Spinal Tappy anthematic, but like the guitar was unbelievable. Like like that's the first time I think I really heard him when I asked Beyond the Astral Skies. That's the name of the record.
Okay.
But like the way he played was so unique. And then of course later on I go, I want to get into the Scorpions. First
Yeah.
it's first it's the Matthias Jobs era, but then I go back, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Love Driving before that, and then I'm like, oh wow, this is actually ahead of its time. It's really interesting. The way it was played, and I know what he means by the dynamic aspect. But yeah, him
Yeah.
heavy metal. I mean, was Worldwide Live, was that a metal band? You know,
I mean, I would say so. And we certainly thought so at the time.
God, yeah.
Um, and you think about like, so if we contrast, this is a bit of a tangent, Uli Jon Roth and Matthias Jobs, two different styles of playing, but I think they also end up making Rudolf Schechner play differently, as the rhythm guitarist who did a few solos. Um,
Yeah,
but but I think that his songwriting, because he is the main songwriter, changes from the one era to the other because of the lead guitarist that he has. Because the
yeah,
drummer's not changing, the bassist isn't changing, obviously the singer isn't changing.
right. Yeah, yeah. But the music did change a lot. I mean, there's a
Yeah,
strong distinction between those eras, let's call them.
yeah,
Love at First Sting, that kind of thing that's well, they were on the radio and
yeah.
it was metal to me.
I mean, I, and this is something I think we've talked about before. I kind of think of it like you got four really solid albums that are metal albums, but they're 70s metal albums with Uli Jon Roth. And then you've got four really solid albums. Okay, Love Drive, you do have Michael Schechner playing on a few tracks, but it's really
Yes,
Matthias Jobs. Four really solid albums, one right after the other in the late 70s, early 80s. And then we get kind of a hiatus, and then we start getting, it's still metal, but they're kind of losing their way with Savage Amusement. And it's just not, up to the standard they'd established. But those two eras, I mean, they're both like, it is definitely still the same band, but they're so divergent from each other, different ways of doing heavy metal.
yeah. And it's so funny about Savage Amusement again. Some of my friends make fun of me because they call them the Tarulli albums, right? And I
That's
love,
me.
it's, I know they do. Like, of course, I love all this stuff, but I also loved Savage Amusement. I thought the songs were really good, but that album flopped, and the fans turned their back. The same with Somewhere in Time. I love that album right out of
Yeah.
the gate, but a lot of my friends are like, I was done with Maiden when that album came out. It's kind of like when Turbo came out, right?
Right, right. Yeah.
A lot of people said,
Yeah, big departures like that are kind of a risk, I suppose. It's interesting because one of the bands we're going to talk about is Def Leppard, and the
mm,
early stuff. You and I, we've talked about this. We really like that. And it's interesting to see what's going on with Pyromania, one of their biggest, and then Hysteria comes out. And by then, it's there's such a divergence between that early sound and that later sound because it's so heavily produced and
Well,
um
heavily is an understatement. The Mutt Lang, I mean, not to interrupt, but it's
yeah,
noting that Hysteria, um, a lot of the notes on the guitar that sound like arpeggiations are separate notes that sound like one guitar because getting the perfect intonation was,
yeah.
and that's why the album took forever. And I mean, nothing was out of tune on the other albums, but Hysteria. Well, that's the first album that Phil Collin was part of,
Yeah,
really.
yeah.
He kind
Well,
of,
we actually have a few things from Joe Elliott
oh
now
yeah,
this is an earlier interview in 2006. And this is a really interesting thing that he said. Lumping us in with Iron Maiden was as ridiculous as lumping us in with Depeche Mode. And we spent 20 odd years trying to tell the whole world that we're not a British heavy metal band. If people finally hear the songs that influenced us, they might get the picture. The year before that, in a New York Post article, he says we've joked about it. We're definitely more Duran Duran than Iron Maiden. 20 top 40 hits in and of itself announces we're not a heavy metal band. Metal, now this is great. Metal is mostly about devil worship and Dungeons and Dragons fantasy stuff. For us, it's always been about human contact, and that's what we've always tried to get across in our songs, whether it be sleazy or classy. It's always about people, not about swords and sorcery. And okay, so Ronnie James Dio and Rainbow, yeah, I get that. But I mean, one of the key themes in a lot of heavy metal bands is just hedonism, right? Or just straight out rebellion.
right.
So I don't know that it's all devil worship and Dungeons and Dragons,
Well, that sounds like somebody's parents talking.
Oh
That
yeah, you're right.
it's kind of like to put this blanket thing. It's like, oh, it's about the devil worship, and it's about, but like, that, I mean, that was a debate everybody had in the 80s, right? Play the
Right.
record backwards. Let's bring Ozzy to court because he killed this kid from,
And Judas Priest too.
Judas
Uh,
Priest.
yeah.
Yeah. It was a,
But so, people did lump them in with Iron Maiden, at least in the sense of classing early Def Leppard as part of the new wave of British heavy metal, along with like Saxon and,
right.
Angel Witch and, Girl School and bands like that. Um, those two first albums, I mean, it does seem like that's heavy metal, fits solidly in there.
It's heavy. I mean, like,
Is
I've,
this like them turning their back on part of their legacy or?
well, I mean, the whole thing is, I think when Phil Collin joined, the only part of Pyromania he did, I think, is the solo to Stage Fright.
Okay.
But then he did the tour, right? And I have some bootlegs of that tour, and of course, they're still playing a lot from High and Dry then because it's the
Yeah.
Pyromania tour. Wasn't the same. I mean, like, Phil Collin, and it had a whole different sound to him. And then when his stereo would have never happened without Phil Collin.
Okay.
And but then from there on out, Def Leppard had a completely new sound, and that's the one thing that changed. And then, of course, sadly, when Steve Clark passed away in the early
Yeah.
90s, um, it's funny because Vivian Campbell's been with him a while, and nothing got heavier there.
Yeah. And I mean, and he's known for, I mean, he played with Dio, right? And
Yeah,
not as like one of two guitarists, he was the sole guitarist.
and
So
he was like a unique sort of innovator in the way he phrased and the way he played. I think we've talked about that before. And
yeah,
what was his band, the River Dogs? After
maybe.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that was it was
What do you make? So he invoked three bands. We're not like Iron Maiden.
right.
We're not, and it's a ridiculous as lumping us in with Depeche Mode. Okay, so Depeche Mode is, electronica and dark new wave and all that.
Right.
But then he says we're definitely more Duran Duran than Iron Maiden. how, I mean, he does say, okay, we've had a lot of hits,
Right.
and Duran had a lot of hits. And I mean, Iron Maiden had some, but they never got radio airplay the way that these bands did. But do you think there's any other ways in which Def Leppard could be more like Duran than Iron Maiden?
I think what he's saying here is, look, we're a pop band because we're on a pop radio. You know,
Okay.
they were even always on the Kiss FM,
So
which,
no musical resemblances.
it's interesting. I guess somebody could make an argument for the way post Pyromania went.
Okay.
But like, it's really funny because I've heard Joe Elliott on interviews, and people are like, "Why don't you play the high and dry stuff?" He goes, "Yeah, we try to add it to the set, and everybody goes gets beers except there's three kids going bananas during the songs, like, and
I mean,
so
there's one song from the earlier era that I think still has currency, Bringing on the Heartbreak,
yeah, that they still
right?
play that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that was their first hit, maybe, because
That's probably right. Yeah.
that was on High and Dry.
Yeah.
But like Let It Go, and I mean, what that album's is one of my top albums, in that genre. And but I don't know if you heard the hit. Of course, every show they play is pretty much all Hysteria, but they did the Las Vegas, and they did Hysteria, and they opened for themselves, right? And they came
How
out.
does that work?
So they came out in plain clothes, and they had like the smaller stage with like amps there and everything, and they gave themselves a different name, and they played all like mostly old stuff.
That's interesting.
I guess in interviews they said a lot of people were booing them, you know like they were just fair weathered fans, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hysteria, and now they're playing stuff from early on, like On Through the Night, uh
Yeah.
and he said like people hated it, like
What?
we would have
It's
never
like they
made
were
it.
carrying out a social experiment or something, you know?
Yeah, and then like because he said, and then later on he said, we're whatever, we're the best Def Leppard cover band ever.
It's like that Dolly Parton actually entered in a Dolly Parton lookalike contest and lost. There are like a couple other people that were ahead of her, you know.
That's like in Seinfeld when Kramer auditioned for the role of Kramer and didn't get it. Oh,
So moving on here, we've got some other interview stuff before we like dig in and like
yeah.
try to draw some conclusions. So this is a really interesting one with Kip Winger. And you almost can't talk about this without bringing up the fact that I forget the name of the kid on Beavis and Butthead
Right.
who was he wore a Winger shirt and they'd make fun of him for it because that's not really metal, according to Beavis and Butthead. So he said, we're not a heavy metal band, we're a heavy band. Heavy metal fans will like us though. We're a lot heavier than the album when you see us live, but heavier in the sense of louder. Some people will call us metal because of a song like Time to Surrender, but when you listen to Without the Night, you can't call something like that metal at all. And then he also said, it's good to have a metal base, but I grew up listening to bands that were on the radio, so we sound commercial, but we don't target it that way. So, I mean, is there a point to calling Winger a heavy metal band? And maybe it depends on how broad we want to make the conception of it. But if he's saying that they're not, what do you think?
I mean, some songs are definitely heavy, like if you listen to Hungry from the first
Okay.
album. Well, it's interesting. It's got metal like stuff, but I it's interesting because Beavis and Butthead came out right when MTV was putting out their new product called grunge, which I really think that,
Yeah, I suppose that's right. That is that same time frame. Yeah.
yeah, and it's interesting because
Do you think they were supposed to represent like dumb metalheads in a way?
well, it, well, there were such lovable characters that we thought it was cool, and I wonder how much because it was in a time where bands like Winger, you know,
Yeah.
were starting to become out of fashion. And really, MTV had a huge hand in bringing in, because they would start to use the word hair metal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was never called hair metal until they wanted to bring in grunge, where it's like, okay, everybody's wearing flannel, nobody's showering, and people are going to come on MTV unrehearsed.
Yeah.
And so when that so like Winger was a perfect target, was the target for that. But I've seen them live a bunch. I mean, they're heavy. I mean, they could get heavy. Red Beach,
Yeah.
virtuoso, and
I mean, because you've interacted with him, has he ever talked about like whether he considers what they're doing to be heavy metal, or does he think of it as essentially like what we've been calling metal adjacent? If you're into metal, you're probably also into this, or
I I'm gonna definitely ask him. I'm gonna see him in a few weeks, actually. And
okay.
he's got that band with Robin McCauley called Black Swan, which
Oh,
is
interesting. Yeah.
their second album is, I mean, they're amazing, but it's not, the second album is like amazing songs, but it's heavy. You know,
Yeah.
you wouldn't call it rock and roll. But you also wouldn't call it like Metallica. It's Robin McCauley. It's
Yeah.
that voice with really heavy guitars. And what would you like? What kind of guitars would you call Reb? I mean, awesome, but he's certainly not a jazz guitarist. He's certainly not a country guitarist, or
Yeah.
roots guitarist. He comes from that whole era of virtuosos with one of the more unique sounds. Him and George Lynch, they kind of had this really unique feel and sound.
Yeah. I mean, in Dokken and Lynch Mob, we definitely consider metal,
Well, see,
right?
even more so Lynch Mob, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, when that came out, that was definitely heavier. But like, yeah, well, I think we always considered Dokken to be a metal band back then, right? I did.
Yeah. I mean, they were definitely more on the glam side. They weren't, so this is an interesting the thing to think about. The further you get into the glam, the more there's an argument for this isn't really heavy metal. Like Poison or Cinderella, it's debatable, right? Um, but there's like a glam part. I mean, even you could say some Motley Crue albums are not really metal albums. Even like think about Theater of Pain following up from Shout at the Devil, but there's some bands that we call glam that have a really hard edge to them, like Rat, for example.
Yeah.
Very melodic, and they have the look and all that. But I was just listening to Scene of the Crime earlier today, and it's got a bite to it, right? And I would say that Dokken a little bit less so than Rat, but there was a bite to it, enough that you would be like, yeah, this is definitely metal.
Yeah, I mean, it was his own kind, like well, like Kiss of Death. That's
Yeah,
Although, it's like it's so funny because sometimes you base it by the singer, and Don was such a pretty singer. He had
yeah,
such wonderful phrasing, unique
yeah,
phrasing, and very melodic. But the music under him was very heavy.
yeah.
Um, double bass drum, and like,
And Jeff Pilson on bass,
oh yeah.
he's got the chops for it. I mean, of course, George Lynch, right? So
And not only that, but Pilson had the pipes, because he was all the harmonies live, which made all the difference.
that's interesting because you think so. I mentioned Rat. So Juan Croucier was the bassist for Dokken before Jeff Pilson, and in Rat, it's funny because Stephen Percy, part of his advertising stuff is the voice of Rat, and
Yes.
that's not quite true because if you listen to Percy just by himself, and I don't mean contemporary Percy because like a
Right.
lot of people as he's aged, his voice has got some problems, but you listen to all the albums, every single one of them, you don't have the Rat voice without the grittiness and the low end of Stephen Percy, and then the high harmonizing of Juan Croucier. And this is actually a great lead in into another band, Van Halen, where Michael Anthony is doing the same thing, he's always on the high harmony. So, there's a book that's called Van Halen Rising: How a Southern California Backyard Party Band Saved Heavy Metal, that this guy Greg Renoff wrote. And now that I think is too big of a claim, that they single-handedly saved heavy metal.
Right.
But it's interesting because he does point out that Van Halen in the 1970s, especially the like mid 70s, when Van Halen is actually like coming together, being called heavy metal was a pejorative. You're not the cool new stuff that's coming out, your old stuff that is going to die out. Nobody's interested in this crap. There's bands, Black Sabbath is kind of losing their momentum. UFO is out touring, but Michael Schechner is always high or drunk. You've got other bands doing that, and then Van Halen really is rising. And so David Lee Roth said something kind of funny about this. He says that they don't play heavy metal or even hard rock. He coined a new phrase, big rock, you know? And he said, we're not a heavy metal band, even though we've been called that. And this is in the 80s. The 80s is here, and Van Halen is young and writing that way. We call it big rock, and it's different from hard rock or heavy metal. He never explained what the hell big rock is supposed to be. And I think most of us would consider, and it's funny too. So I'll get your take on this in a minute. I'll throw out something probably controversial. The David Lee Roth era is definitely heavy metal. All those albums, even 1984, which has some really heavy, scorching tracks on there, like Girl Gone Bad. I mean, Panama's a little bit more radio friendly, but it's a heavy song,
Riff, that intro riff, yeah.
Jump might be an outlier, right? All Weight is actually kind of, it's somewhere in between heavy metal and new wave, I'd say. But, and then after that, when it's the Van Hagar, okay, maybe they're more hard rock then, I don't think Sammy Hagar has quite the same vocal presence that David Lee Roth in his heyday had. And there's a lot more keyboard stuff, in the later albums, I would say. So I don't know. Do you consider post David Lee Roth Van Halen to be heavy metal, or would you say it's something different?
No, it's something different. I mean, I actually think the Roth albums are, I don't know, there's elements of heavy metal, but to me they're like killer rock and roll records.
Okay.
I don't, that Van Halen's always been a tricky one for me, because when I put the album on, right? Like Van Halen 1.
Yeah.
All I can say is this is so classic sounding,
Okay.
the Marshalls, and it's like, in all of Eddie's influences were rock and rollers, and Clapton was his favorite, oddly enough. And,
yeah.
So I think, I think they were completely unique. I mean, big rock, I get it, because, you go see a show and you're going to get a show.
That's right. Yeah.
And,
well, it does. I mean, there's a bigness that definitely comes through those albums, and you think about it, like, so it's a 4-piece. You've got a singer, and he's doing interesting vocals, but you only have 3 instruments.
right.
Eddie Van Halen's guitar, that's got to do all the work. Now, I mean, Michael Anthony is one hell of a bassist. Lots of cool fills.
Said over the years.
What's that?
Despite what everybody has said over the years about.
Yeah.
You listen to those albums; those are some great bass parts.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that got before the internet, especially. I don't know why everybody just kind of laughed, like, oh, Michael Anthony's, I think he got that rap because of his bass solo was all noise. And he he drank Jack Daniels, whether it was real or not.
Yeah.
He had.
I remember seeing them in it was 85 or 86, and watching him on stage, because we were pretty close to it, and just chugging it. And I was old enough that I could recognize that would probably kill you,
Yeah, well, it depends on what he's drinking, I guess. But I even on the what was it, the video Live Without a Net, he did it.
Okay.
And of course, when I'm a kid, I'm like, whoa, But then I got older, I was like, was that iced tea?
I mean, this is totally off topic, but I remember being at a party when I was maybe 18 or 19, and it was with like older people, and there was a guy who was like a local bartender, and I was at his place, and he had a bottle of Southern Comfort. And I saw him just like drink, like tilt it back and drink like a third of the bottle in one pull. And no, there wasn't any faking about that. And I was like, holy crap, what is with this guy? But he was like drinking every single day, and he was in his late 20s. So he presumably had plenty of practice, So
Yeah, well, it's like it turns out, because we know Stevie Ray Vaughan got sober, but as it turns out, he started every day with a full bottle of Jack Daniels with cocaine in it. And
wow.
we didn't know that at the time, but just a bottle of Jack Daniels in the morning would kill someone. So he obviously was a professional, and I guess he was thrown into rehab by his band because he was,
Yeah.
you know. But anyway, yeah, the Michael Anthony thing. But you know, there's no, they're definitely heavy. They were definitely heavy. But like the Roth era stuff was just, I guess, because of the fact that it sounds classic, although Eddie was an innovator, you know,
Yeah.
and so, and he was kind of the precursor to, like, a lot of people wanted to be him that were in metal bands.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So would you say they're metal adjacent rather than heavy
yeah,
metal?
yeah,
Okay.
because they were, it wouldn't be weird that, Van Halen's on Monsters of Rock with Judas Priest. That's not weird, right?
Yeah.
Um, Maybe the Sammy stuff might be a little weird, but I mean, Eddie himself was a force. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I mean, I like
I mean, it's
both.
interesting because David Lee Roth on his own, I don't think managed to put together an album that really was metal,
No,
even when bringing in metal musicians.
yeah, he had
Steve Vai, right?
and Billy Sheehan.
Yep.
Yeah, though that first album was, it was rambunctious because that's who he is, but I don't know if I'd call it,
Yeah.
like, I don't know if I'd say Yankee Rose was a metal tune,
Yeah. Yeah.
or Big.
I'd agree.
Like, I think they were great. They are great songs. I loved listening to the album, but I don't know if I'd ever call it. What's so funny is sometimes genres are just the people. I would call it David Lee Roth.
Yeah. Well, here's a good example. So let's jump ahead and talk about Kiss. There's a lot of
Yes.
debate. Is Kiss a heavy metal band? And so, as opposed to bands that are saying, no, 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 we're not really heavy metal, we're something different, Kiss deliberately frame themselves as heavy metal. And some people are like, yeah, they weren't really like that. So, when they didn't have a manager in the very, very early days, they sent like invitations for shows saying, featuring heavy metal masters Kiss. And the concept was supposed to be, like they said, a heavy metal Beatles. And this is like early 70s heavy metal because their
Right.
albums are coming out in the mid 70s. And they used the term heavy metal whenever it made sense or was advantageous to do so, not so much like it really fit. And they always got onto metal compilations.
Yeah.
Masters of Metal has um, what was the song that was on it? I think it was from the Animalize album. But I mean, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
They're always doing that, and they tour with heavy metal bands.
Yeah.
So Gene Simmons actually says in an issue of Kerrang, the term heavy metal is self-defeating. When I think of heavy metal, I've always thought of elves and evil dwarves and evil princes and
There we go
princesses.
again.
And then he says a lot of the Maiden and Priest records were real metal records. But then he also says, and this is bizarre, I sure as hell don't think Metallica's metal or Guns N' Roses is metal, or Kiss is metal, because it doesn't deal with the ground opening up and little dwarves coming out riding dragons, like bad Dio records. So this might be reflective of the beef between Gene Simmons and Ronnie James Dio, but it's something we saw echoed earlier. But if you think that it's about dragons, dwarves, and stuff like that, how the hell do you think that Iron Maiden or Priest are heavy metal? Because they're not singing about that kind of stuff. There are supernatural themes in Iron Maiden songs some of the time, but they're taken from, horror literature or something like that. They're not
Yeah,
about
right.
rainbows or, and to say that Metallica's not metal, I mean,
No,
what was he thinking? Like,
nothing else matters, maybe.
yeah, I mean, how do you say that about Creeping
Ride the light.
Death, or Hit the Lights or.
Or anything, yeah, Ride the Lightning, like all Master of Puppets, that era.
Yeah. So
That
I think this is reflective a little bit of a very pragmatic. We'll use the term heavy metal whenever it works for us, but frankly, we don't really see ourselves that way. But we're perfectly willing to have fans of heavy metal support us and,
be on heavy
see
metal
us.
compilations.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
But I think Kiss is heavy metal. Um,
I mean, especially the live experience,
okay, yeah.
spitting blood, breathing fire, you're a cartoon
Yeah,
character.
the stage show, yeah.
And that's something you wouldn't bring your mom to back then, or certainly not your grandmother.
Yeah.
But this, like, the songs are rock and roll, but were they metal of the time? We have to remember time and
So
place.
in the 70s, yeah, heavy metal is less clear what it includes, and it's also got that sense of by the mid 70s oh, this is dying stuff. You don't want to be affiliated with this. Punk, disco, these other genres are what are really more important. Um, but by the 80s, when metal is big, I think they're perfectly willing to describe themselves that way again.
Yeah, I mean, we know that Gene Simmons is more interested in the business side,
Yeah,
and I think he's intentionally been controversial. I don't know if you remember in the 80s, he used to say women can't play rock, right?
yeah,
And I don't think he believed that. I think, if he made I feel like I think if he made extreme he said this once. He said if you make, kind of polarizing extreme comments, people might hate you, but the people that like you will never leave you. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Part of
Well, and one way to be controversial is to contradict yourself, to say this over here and this over here, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
then you're
right.
guaranteed if the people put it together, there's going to be a controversy.
Hmm. Oh yeah, like every time he's interviewed, you could just see the look in his face that he's ready to start something, right? And,
Yeah.
and there's that what's the legendary NPR interview. I don't know if you ever heard about that, with what's her name, and it's NPR, and he's saying he was making the argument, you have an advantage over me. You could sell your body for sex and make money. I can't, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
of course that made news,
Headlines, yeah. Yeah.
and and you know there's no intelligent person, and I think he's an intelligent guy that would
Yeah.
bring up that would think that's okay. That was
Yeah.
that was like he knows going to NPR and then acting like the jerk Gene Simmons was going to get him press, sell some records, and his
Yeah.
face to go, yeah, Gene, uh, um yeah, it was like on Oprah, when they were on Oprah in the mid 80s, like there was girls in the crowd like yelling at him, like, you think girls can't play? Like, what if I want to meet you after a show and, talk bass with you, you know? And
Yeah.
because like, so girls are groupies, but that alone could be metal, just, the causing trouble. Um, but like themes of like, like Love Gun or, you know,
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Now with the controversy because of contradiction part, Motorhead's a great example because I mean, I considered them heavy metal when I was younger. They certainly played with a lot of heavy metal bands and inspired a ton of heavy metal bands.
Yeah.
Lemmy like to claim that Motorhead is not a heavy metal band. Um, and he'd often say, like, we are Motorhead and we play rock and roll.
Right.
Now, playing rock and roll doesn't necessarily mean that you can't play metal, but he would say, um, all of a sudden in 1979, everything was heavy metal. We were heavy metal. Now, this is funny. I mean, Journey were heavy metal. You think about people claiming that Queen was heavy metal.
Right.
Hawkwind were heavy metal. Very strange. And yeah, Hawkwind really isn't heavy metal. There's something kind of metal adjacent and pretty cool, but yeah, I mean, they're not, even when Lemmy is with them, they're not heavy metal. And I found this interesting interview from classic rock that was titled "How a Motorhead Producer Nearly Talked Himself Out of a Job." So Cameron Webb was talking about going in and meeting with the band, and he approached them and he said, "I want to make a heavy metal record." And Lemmy said, "Cameron, we're a rock and roll band. We're not a heavy metal band." And so he almost didn't get the gig because he's mislabeling them. On the other hand, there's all sorts of interviews out there where Lemmy is perfectly fine to say, the new wave of British heavy metal, we were the first in that, we were inspiring these people, we're more metal than so and so. So, I don't want to say that he's doing this in bad faith, but it certainly does seem inconsistent. And I don't know. I mean, would you consider Motorhead to be, if you ask me, like, who are your favorite metal bands? For me, Motorhead is one of them.
Right.
So it seems weird for me to say that they're not heavy metal. And certainly, like you pointed out, there's certain themes like rebellion. Being rebellious by itself doesn't make you heavy metal because you could be punk or you could be something else. But if you're playing the way that they play, it strikes me that you're probably heavy metal.
Well, it's funny because I want to go back to uh and I love this, the Saxon's cover of Ride Like the Wind.
All right.
It worked because the lyrics are pretty metal. You know,
Right.
the lyrics are like like when you heard Saxon do it, you're like, this is a metal tune, you know? And then the joy of hearing that Christopher Cross loved the cover, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, I never thought of it that way. Like I've known that song my whole life, but then when they did it, it's like, wow, that's some metal lyrics.
Yeah.
um, I guess I'm pointing that out, like, um, that's part of the definition of it. But with Lemmy, I guess I would say, I guess there's some band that you say, okay, they're a rock and roll band, but I would have no problem or wouldn't think twice if somebody called them a metal band.
Yeah. I mean,
You know
are
what I-
those incompatible categories, do you think, or not? Because he's not just saying we're rock, he's saying we're rock and roll.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, the problem is metal comes from rock and roll,
Yeah.
and like the early bands, yeah, I mean, just the nature of sonic wise with Motorhead, sonically and appearance
I
wise,
mean,
it's heavy metal.
Fast Eddie Clark is definitely playing as a metal guitarist, right?
Right.
There's the riffs, there's the distortion. Um, what Lemmy's doing with his bass, I mean, I would say though those are metal riffs because he's doing the whole support stuff. And
And
I
the way he
mean,
sings.
Phil Taylor, Stinky Phil, guy who has to be told to wash every so often, you
Yeah.
know, he seems pretty metal too. And even when you add in new people, right? So Brian Robertson coming from Thin Lizzy, getting up there in bicycle shorts, not fitting in with the thing. I mean, if I hadn't heard about that and I only listened to Another Perfect Day, I would say, yeah, that's definitely a metal album. So he might not have been a metal musician, but he fit into a heavy metal band. And then once you add Phil Campbell and Wurzel, It's a metal band, I think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. God, I had thought that's a good point. With Motorhead, I was going to go back to Motorhead. Yeah. Um, I think the fact that Lemmy was a whiskey guzzling. They'll
Yeah.
just. But he was, I gotta say, he was a bright and cultured guy. It's
Yeah, oh
like,
yeah.
he,
Thoughtful.
yeah, he was very thoughtful. And I don't know if you ever saw like him responding to letters, and a black kid wrote him and said, I really like your music,
Yeah.
and he had this whole thoughtful thing, and like the bottom line was, he says, why is it such a crime for someone to be happy, right? In the end,
Yeah.
it's kind of like, why would they pick on you? And but and when he met Joni Mitchell, he was like, I can never figure out this, I can never figure out this chord that you're playing in this song. And she says, well, Lenny, she thought his name was Lenny. She says, I use different tunings. And like, for that one, I use a different tuning. Maybe that's why you can't find the chord. But like,
Okay.
he's going up to these people that aren't metal adjacent, going, hey, on this record, I can't, he was,
Yeah.
he loved a lot of music, and
Well, it's sort of like musician to musician or performer to performer. Yeah.
happened more in the old days, right? Backstage, it would be Miles Davis hanging out with Joni Mitchell and Jimi Hendrix.
There's pictures of him with Debbie Harry, you know.
Yeah, and but Motorhead would absolutely make the back of the jean jacket, as I always said, right?
Yeah, yeah. And again, it would be in like it wouldn't be like on the side of the metal albums. It would be centrally featured in whether in your collection or in a record store, you know.
And I totally, this is what I was going to say. I saw Motorhead open for Maiden years ago,
Mm,
and they went over amazing. The place was going bananas for Lemmy,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and that's got to say something,
I
you
think
know,
so.
if you
Yeah.
had, but then when Wasted opened for it, they weren't accepted at all, you
You
know.
know, the only song before later on I listened to Wasted that I knew was Rock Steady because it was on the Metal Killers collection.
Yeah,
And it's good, but it's definitely you could say, okay, it's kind of slow. There's not a lot going on in it compared to some of the other stuff on the collection. It was a fun song to sing along to. But
right.
I mean, that was part of the problem. You're going to open for Iron Maiden. You better like really have the chops, you know?
I mean, the guitar player had the chops, but it just, I mean, it was like the singer was like a Jimmy Jameson.
Okay.
I mean, I'm a great singer. I loved his voice, but he's, you don't want that voice opening for Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
It's not that it was good or bad, because Dickinson's amazing, but it's great in a different genre. But
Yeah.
like, the fact that Motorhead's opening or playing on the same bill with metal bands and killing it, right?
Or
Uh,
having metal bands open for them,
or
you
open,
know?
yeah, and yeah, right. But
So, I mean, should we consider that at all as not like completely decisive, but as like a piece of evidence? Who do you tour with?
ooh,
Especially if you're in the, main band thing and you decide I want this band to tour with us. If you're really spending a lot of time with metal bands, does that kind of rub off on you? Does that
I think that's a good test, right? We could play this game. Um, uh, take earlier Metallica. Let's go to 1980s Metallica.
okay? Yeah.
Now, who do you think? Now, we would know who would, like, you and I could pick the openers, and we can absolutely say who would not succeed, or it would be like, oil and water.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of a test, because that's something I think most people that are into it could answer, right? Um, like, who would succeed opening for Motorhead? Well, a good metal band would definitely do it.
Yeah.
Or with the Rolling Stones,
Well, they
Yeah,
would never open for
well, I know,
Motorhead,
but
but
would
yeah,
like
you could say a kind of like bluesy hard rock band. Could they work? And it would be kind of iffy. I think they'd
because
have to
like
have they'd have to bring something to the table that the fans would really want and be familiar with, or just like come out of the gate and just like blow them away, you know?
I mean uh, I used them as I used the Rolling Stones as that's a classic rock and roll band.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we're gonna say that
And
Motor,
Lemmy likes them, you know?
oh, he loves them, yeah.
Yeah.
But like that, so maybe we could say rated between the Rolling Stones and early Metallica. Where are you? You know, and
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
he's certainly not Rolling Stones rock and roll, right?
yeah.
Um, so
I mean, one of the bands that I mean, yeah. So one band in particular, I was actually thinking of too, because I think Tank did also open for Motorhead at various points, and Tank definitely consider themselves metal. Interesting though, Algie Ward was from the punk stuff.
yeah,
He'd been in the Damned and the Saints and stuff like that, and he's definitely the band leader. But Girls School, right? Girls School definitely considered themselves part of the new wave of British heavy metal. They did lots of opening for Motorhead and then collaborations with them in the early 80s, you know.
yeah.
So
It's funny because
even swapping songs, you know.
yeah, you know, I should ask, you know, one of my longtime friends and colleagues is Joe Stump, who's, you know, they call him Shred Lord because
Okay.
you know, he's kind of like one of the great shredders. And, you know, for those of you that don't know him, check him out. But, you know, he even in school, he's got dark shades, he's got the metal hair, he's got the um all black rockin' outfit, and he's in Alcatraz now. He's been in Alcatraz
Okay.
about a year, and he's on the last album. But he's on the new Girl School album too, and the video has
Oh,
him
is he? Okay.
as a cartoon character.
Yeah.
So I always talk to him because we've played shows together, and you know, anybody that follows him would say he's like, you know, European metal, you know, because you know, it's kind of
Yeah.
like it's more like Ingve.
Yeah.
But me and him talk about Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix and Schenker. Like those are his probably top three, and
Okay.
probably Ingve too. But it's funny because he'll go out and then Blackmore. We
Oh,
talk
well, let's talk about him. Your favorite Scowler, right?
my failures. So yeah, the perfect segue into Blackmore because that would answer some questions. And you know, I think I'm going to ask Joe some of these questions because he'd have great insight because
Yeah.
he's in some of these bands, he's played with some of these people, and you know he's inspired by these people. But I'm sure if you ask Joe if he's heavy metal, he'd say yes. But
Yeah. Whereas
but he played,
Blackmore so we dug up an old interview from 1984. So exactly the time when it would be so beneficial to call yourself heavy metal, right?
I
So he says, I've always admired AC/DC. Now, this is really funny what he says after this. I don't like them particularly as a band, but they've stuck steadfastly to their own brand of straightforward music through thick and thin. To my mind, when they first started out, AC/DC sounded incredibly dated. Suddenly, the rock and roll world turned full circle and the band took off, and that was just great. They kept hanging on to their principles until the right time came along. And then he said, in a way, you can draw a parallel between Deep Purple and AC/DC. We're just going to go out and do what we were best known for, playing sophisticated rock, not heavy metal, and hopefully there'll be a few people out there who like it. So this is like, Perfect Strangers time,
Yes, it's
when that album is going to be sold as a metal album. And then he also had something to say about Van Halen. So he says, without wishing to revel in my own artistic values, there is an art to playing heavy rock and roll. It's not no use just cranking up the volume and being loud. There's a trick to it. There are dynamics and certain progressions that you can play, but you don't hear much of that today. I think Van Halen are interesting. And again, I don't particularly like them as a band, but there is a lot of movement, a lot of color to the material they produce. And that kind of disjunction between, I don't really like them as a band, but what they're doing here is really something admirable in a certain respect, right?
well,
Typical Blackmore.
well, it's funny because this is like these are thinly veiled put downs, right?
Hmm.
I don't like them, first of all, but then really what he's saying is they really stuck to their crappy music. Like I really admire you for, like the same with the word interesting with Van Halen, right? I don't
Okay.
like them, but there's a lot of movement, a lot of color. What does that mean? Like these are, and then when he says, he kind of says, except we play, they play their straightforward dated music, right? But
Yeah.
Purple plays their sophisticated,
Sophisticated. Yeah.
right? So it's, there's a lot of shade thrown, as they say, in those comments. It's kind of like, okay, like, you're saying something nice, but then you should have stopped at that,
Yeah. Yeah.
you said, I admire that they kept doing their same thing. Not that I don't like it and it's boring and dated, but they stuck with it.
Yeah. But I mean, is Deep Purple a heavy metal band? I mean, so many metal bands drew on them and were influenced by them. I mean, I would say that Gillan's side project band, once he quit doing fusion jazz and stuff, that's a heavy metal band. White Snake comes out of it, Rainbow comes out of it, you know. Bruce Dickinson, when he's thinking about like who does he want to model himself after, it's Ian Gillan. So
Yeah, right.
I don't know. There's definitely some songs that are clearly metal. Sometimes there's other stuff that's mixed in with that, but even Black Sabbath has some, going
Right.
through changes or, um, you know, um, National Acrobat or stuff like that are not metal songs. And Judas Priest has some non-metal songs,
Right.
on albums at different points. So I don't think that excludes you.
I think, well, if you think about it, like for the time, what was
For the
heavy?
time I mean, they're definitely associated as heavy metal, right?
Yeah, because like Burn, that
Yeah.
tune, I mean, even by today's standards, that's metal to me,
Yeah.
right? I don't know if it's
Yeah.
because of my age and like we were almost there at the time, and it's not like we have to look back on something we didn't experience as it happened, but Burn, like, and Coverdale in Whitesnake did Burn every night still.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And that's with Reb Beach and Joel Hoskra. And
Yeah.
you know, when they start that riff, it is the rock pose, the metal pose, everything. I'm like, that's heavy. That's like, you know, that's pretty metal. That's one of the more metal things they played during the night.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess to chalk it up to, I would say like the bands back then, there wasn't heavy metal. That word wasn't around in the 70s, I don't think, right?
It was, but it was used in a looser way. And sometimes it was just used pejoratively. Like by the mid 70s,
Right.
it meant, the old stuff that we're getting past. I mean, people that are reappropriating it by 78, 79, saying, hey, we do heavy metal, not this stuff, not this stuff, not this stuff. And then we get things like the LA scene developing and getting big. Japan, as we explored before,
Yeah.
but especially the new wave of British heavy metal. I mean, this is actually a good one of the things we were going to talk about is so we don't really have a working definition of heavy metal in part because it's a moving target.
Yep.
So I think a lot of younger um, viewers, listeners can sometimes get confused because it's got like a clear sense or at least spectrum by the 80s and 90s, and they miss that earlier term in the 70s. Actually, I mean, I have to take it back about the pejorative thing. So, music critics are using it pejoratively in the early 70s. They're like, this is crap because it's heavy metal, right? But then, the
Yeah.
fans are totally ignoring the music critics. Um, I think the more like widespread use of it as pejorative would be like from like 76 onward, you know. And so Deep Purple could be lumped in with heavy metal. I mean, Black Sabbath is definitely heavy metal. Even, Uriah Heep
Yeah.
would get lumped in with that. But there were weird outliers, like we, mentioned, considering Queen heavy metal, you got to have kind of a loose
Yeah.
boundary to do that, but people were in the late 70s. Um, or Grand Funk Railroad was one that was sometimes called heavy metal. Actually, here's a good sort of like way of putting this in perspective. Think about that movie Heavy Metal, right?
Yes.
And when you watch it, there's a number of artists and songs in it, and you're like, what the hell is this?
Right.
There's some hard rock here, but this isn't heavy metal, and then there's some stuff that's definitely heavy metal in it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because, yeah, Blue Oyster Cult had Veteran of the Psychic Wars in
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
And that's not a heavy metal tune. I
yeah.
mean, it may, but
I mean, they do have some songs like Godzilla is definitely heavy metal, don't
yeah,
you think?
yeah. I mean, it's like that's a heavy riff to start. And it's like one of those riffs people wanted to like learn, like
Yeah, yeah,
heavy riffs. Um, yeah, I mean, especially when, the album version, yeah, but like, anytime you hear it live, it's much heavier. And I think, they've said um on the album we're not metal, live we're metal,
yeah.
which is
Well, we do have some stuff from them. So let's take a look at that real briefly. This is just from one interview where um, they had a couple people. So um, they were asked, are you a heavy metal band? So then Rick says, we wouldn't be considered heavy metal. There's a lot of people who don't consider us a heavy metal band. Then again, there's a lot of people who do. So it's hard to say. So it's interesting that he's not saying, well, I know what we are. He's saying,
right.
people say different things. And then Eric says, I think we do heavy metal songs, but we're not a heavy metal group. And then Rick says, I think we're a hard rock band. And then Rick says, when I think of metal now, I think of Motley, Motorhead, Girl School, Def Leppard. Isn't that interesting? Because, we've got Def Leppard later on saying, no, we're not. And Motorhead kind of mixed with that. And then Eric adds Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Rick says Scorpions, they're all in there. And then Eric says metal's back in vogue. And then Rick says our show tends to be heavy metal. And okay, so this is fair. Eric says, "Look at Burnin' for You." That's not a metal song, or I
Right.
mean, he could have added "Don't Fear the Reaper,"
Right.
but he says that Godzilla is and "Take Me Away" is. Um, so verdict's kind of out, right?
Take Me Away. It's a heavy, is it a heavy metal song? It's like, I mean, they're heavy tunes, and you have to realize they were in the early stages. And, you know, talking to Buck Dharma, he's always like, well, no, we're always trying to do the Haight Ashbury thing. We came from
Yeah, yeah,
It's an Airplane, and we came from the Dead. And then on that metal show, and they had him and the singer from Kix, I think, and someone else, and they went around questions. They said, if you were in your band, what band would you want to be in? And Buck Dharma's answer was the Grateful Dead, which is, you
that's
wouldn't,
interesting.
yeah, he's like, he's always said he's a huge, they grew up with the Haight Ashbury, the San Francisco thing. That's,
Yeah,
but when they wrote, yeah, I I don't hear nothing's apparent. Nothing about their music, even their first album was, I mean, those songs are definitely very heavy for the early 70s.
yeah. It's interesting because we reviewed their latest album a while back,
Yeah.
and I think we said it was clearly a heavy metal album, right?
Yeah, like That Was Me, the first tune. It's kind of heavy in riff, but like, the lyrics are somebody being, proud of causing ruckus, that
Yeah,
fine red bottle of wine that's smashed on the street, that was me, like,
yeah,
so,
yeah,
you know, the lyrics. And I always thought that, it's because they always said, um, all the Buck Dharma songs make it on the radio, and that Eric doesn't have a voice for radio, although he's a great singer, but he's, you could say like Dominance and Submission and all those tunes. He had, that he was more metal when he sang, obviously.
Okay. Yeah.
Like he had that, and he had that persona live back then where he had the rants,
Yeah.
about Lucifer,
Who did he say in that interview, going back to if you could be in any band, who did Eric Bloom say he would be in
Oh,
with? Do
Eric
you
Bloom
remember?
wasn't there.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I forget what the singer from Kick said. Oh, one of them, God, who was the third person? One of them said the Doors, which was really
That's
shocking.
interesting.
It might have been the guitarist from Kicks. It might have been Kicks with Buck Dharma.
Okay.
Um,
So total taking us off route here, but let me turn that on you as a professional guitarist. Same question. You could be in any band and we'll make it from any time.
oh,
So
geez.
it could be going back into the 60s, it could be, contemporary. Could you actually answer that question? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
It really depends. I mean, if I would want to be in Deep Purple for different reasons, I would want to be Sting's guitarist.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
But
I
now if
would.
you were in Deep Purple, you would have to replace Ritchie Blackmore.
Yes,
So
well, but I really loved. Oh my God, why am I forgetting his name? Tommy Bolin.
yeah, yeah.
He's successful, and Blackmore loved him, which was odd that Blackmore loved anyone. And but he replaced Joe Walsh, and I think even though it's like a wild, like you can't, it's impossible to do. Tommy Bolin, that "Come Taste the Band," I love that album. It's heavy.
Yeah.
It's I love that album, "Come Taste the Band." But to be in that era, playing for huge crowds every night, that's, but for different reasons, touring with Sting, it would be, that would be like playing the great songs every night, but like kind of being in the background, right?
Okay.
So, that nobody would know my name. They'd
Yeah.
say, but so, well, I don't know if it would be Deep Purple really, but like a band like Deep Purple where they were like epic, the songs were great. Early Def Leppard would have been a blast. To
Okay. Yeah. Well, and there they got two guitarists, so you could easily
yeah,
sub in for one of them,
let's say High and Dry just came out. If
You're
someone,
you're gonna hate this, but
okay,
you could be the Yannick Ayers, the third guitarist.
I always say, I don't love the his guitar playing, and all this,
Yeah.
but I always come back to he's doing something right because he's been a member of one of the greatest metal bands of all time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he seems like a really sweet guy. So, what does my stupid opinion matter about?
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
terrible player. I'm a
I, you know, I think there's probably an analogy to like music, professional stuff like playing guitar, where you're at a very high level, you can actually evaluate somebody else's stuff, but there's different like styles and temperaments, right? And we can say, like, people ask me, so I teach a lot of different philosophical figures, and they'll be like, when are you going to do Spinoza? And I'll be like, I'm not into Spinoza.
right.
I acknowledge that he's an important philosopher. I just not into him. I will occasionally teach him in classes, but do I want to shoot videos on him? Not really. And maybe it's like that with you with Yannick Ayers, where you can be like, hey, I mean, like you said, if Dave Murray likes having him around, and you certainly respect Dave Murray, you can say, well, there's got to be something there. I just don't see it.
Yeah. Oh, and then my equivalent would be like, why don't you put up Yannick Gers transcriptions? Like why don't you
Oh, in Guitar World or something like that.
or even post on social media? Because I tend to do the only ones I really
Oh,
am.
right. For your transcriptions. Okay.
Yeah. So like, you know, I typically do different instruments and challenge myself. But if somebody's like, why did you do Yannick Gers? It would be like your Spinoza. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
you know, he's an important guy and like, you know, has done what people wildly dream about, but no, I'm not going to get into it. You know, I'm not.
Yeah.
I guess that's the parallel between us, kind of like, well, you're a philosopher, you must like, you know,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And I think sometimes, maybe, we're human, right? So we can only take in a limited range of stuff. And the more that we spend on some things, that leaves us with less attention or energy for other stuff. So, you think about Iron Maiden, you as a guitarist, you got two great guitarists that you can look to, from album after album, Dave Murray, Adrian Smith, both different from each other. They're not like clones
Right.
of each other. Or, like with Rat, I know you're a huge fan of Warren DeMartini,
Right.
um, but maybe not so much of Robin Crosby, right?
I
Um,
mean, he was great for his role. I know he
yeah,
was lead guitarist before Warren got in, and
yeah,
you know, it was kind of like a big slight when all the solos went to Warren because he was better looking and played better.
yeah.
Uh, but no, I
So I think we don't have to like everybody or appreciate
right.
everybody. I mean, it doesn't mean we have to diss them. We don't have to be like Kevin Dubrow when he was like, all these other bands suck.
You know, there's got to be
But
something to the trash talking because metal. I don't know if it's by design or they're just immature to like go on record to, like
yeah,
to go in print to say things that people they'll probably run into at parties or the people they'll run into.
it's interesting too with that case. And now we're like really off topic, but it's fun. And we should
Yeah.
probably talk about this one a little bit more depth. So there's like the trash talking, which is like you let a odd remark slide here or there, right? And that's one thing. And then you've got the trash talking that we've seen in some of these interviews, like Ritchie Blackmore with a snide little comment, or Gene Simmons, clearly dissing Ronnie James Dio, which he always does. And those two had bad blood for a long time. And frankly, Dio, I think, is the more intelligent person than and probably more truthful than Simmons. And
Yeah.
then you've got like what Kevin Dubrow did, which is like show after show after show, interview after interview, sticking to a thing saying Quiet Riot were the real LA heavy metal band. All these other bands are basically piggybacking off of us, and they're not as good, which was, I mean, kind of dumb. Clearly not true because Van Halen was around at the same time that Quiet Riot was, and even like Mickey Rat was around before Rat comes out. But clearly also false in that these other bands suck. I mean, Rat was great. I mean, Dokken is also from that region and era. Van Halen was great, and it got him tons and tons of bad blood. So
Yep.
he kind of threw away the goodwill that he developed, So I think we got three different things there. The offhand comment, the I just have a beef with this person, and then like the blanket, we're the only good band in the world.
Yeah, I mean, like I keep thinking is like is that immaturity or is that by design because it's metal to be controversial? I don't know. I mean, I would say
Yeah.
mature.
I don't yeah, it might have been here's a way it could be both, right? You could be like, this is actually a good strategy for creating controversy, and that's going to keep driving our record sales. Because at the time that he's doing it, Metal Health made it to number one, and all of that. But that could stem from an immature assessment of what's going to work for you going forward. I mean, if you're bad mouthing everybody in your scene, that
Right.
doesn't seem like a great strategy for long-term growth, you know.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of reasons you're going to bump into these people and
Yeah.
uh and it's when it's in print and
That's an interesting feature too. He's dissing all the local area bands. It'd be different if he's like, yeah, these German rockers like
Right.
Accept and Scorpions, they suck. Germans don't know how to do heavy metal. We know how to do it here in LA, right? Then it could be like local pride, but instead
Yeah.
it's like it's the proverbial crapping where you eat.
Yeah. Oh, that's it. Yeah. Yeah. That was always just it was when you hear stuff like him, like what he says so often, it's like almost hyperbolic. You know,
Yeah.
it's 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 almost surreal. It's like, okay, come on, let's calm, let's bring it down a few notches. We heard you the third time.
Yeah. So to wrap this up, because we're kind of getting
Yeah.
on with the time. So I've put some thought into what might motivate a band or artist that is identified as heavy metal to say that they're not. And I'm curious to see if you've got more ideas to add to this list. So one could be like a worry at a time that heavy metal is being dismissed. You don't want to be associated with that. You don't want to be dismissed or pigeonholed or misunderstood as just being heavy metal.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that could make sense. So it went, like you mentioned, during the grunge era, if you're kind of marginally heavy metal, maybe you jump ship, right?
Yep.
And then there were some bands that went in the opposite direction that, like we mentioned, is Kiss really heavy metal? They certainly were willing to call themselves heavy metal whenever it was convenient for them, and then maybe not so much when it's not.
Right.
Um, and then we could think about bands that kind of wavered back and forth. Uli Jon Roth, right? I mean, he acknowledges that he was playing heavy metal with the Scorpions in that early era, and he's like, yeah, I'm not into that. And you're
Right.
like, wow, for somebody who wasn't into that, you sure did some pretty good work.
Yeah. I'll
Um,
say. Yeah.
and we could say that maybe sometimes if you identify yourself as metal at a time like the early 80s when it's rising, it gives you some space for moving around, some room to maneuver. You don't have to worry about fans feeling betrayed by you deviating from heavy metal. So, like Def Leppard, I don't think that if you asked them in 1984 that, are you heavy metal or not? I don't think they'd say, no, we're not heavy metal. I think they'd be perfectly willing to call themselves that. It's only later on that they're going to shift from that,
Yeah, they certainly couldn't say it after Hysteria.
that they were heavy metal.
They couldn't say that. Yeah, I mean, there's not really anything metal on that album.
Yeah.
I mean,
Although I think it was being sold as a heavy metal album, right?
well, that's what they were known for previously, I guess. But I mean,
Yeah.
that just blew up the charts, that album, and um, yeah, I mean, and sadly, that's kind of like no matter what album they're touring, they still play that whole album in the set because they're sticking to 1988. But that's another story. We've talked about that one, but
Yeah. Not supporting new work and all of that. Yeah.
yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Being kind of treating their music like a museum, rather than moving forward. But they, they have their reasons, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So what else do you think needs to be said about this? Like, is this band, I mean, in one respect, you could say, well, whatever the artist says goes, right? But it doesn't quite seem like that. If a band says we're not heavy metal, some people could say, no, no, you still are, even though you think you're not.
That's an interesting thing. What if they went to one of these bands and they said, we're a rock and roll band? Well, we surveyed 300 people, metal fans, that say that you're a heavy metal band. I mean, which matters? Like which would we go by? Would we go by the intention of the artist, or would we go the perception of the artist?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the way that things get classified commercially now. Like I use, and you tell me whether the stuff that you use does this. I use Apple music, and there's a lot of bands that we clearly consider to be central classic heavy metal bands that get placed in rock. And then there's other bands that sometimes get placed in metal, and you're like, I'm not sure about that, you know?
Well, didn't we do that when the metal section started to come out at like the record stores? They finally had a metal section, and then I would pick
Right.
through, and we would go, "This isn't metal," or I remember doing that with my friends. I mean,
That's true. Yeah, yeah. We had debates about
oh,
that sort of thing.
I don't use streaming, so I don't see how the algorithms work like that. But
Okay.
but like I'm with you because we used to pick through this is and then to be safe they just put in the like the real like thrash metal stuff that's like clearly metal. Um uh but yeah, we used to pick through, it's like, yeah, is this metal? And then I think the classification, I think you said it earlier. I think saying heavy metal pigeonhole someone. They don't want
Yeah.
to be lumped in with this is like other stuff. And this is
Yeah, I
like,
mean, the rock category opens you up to greater commercial possibilities, you could say.
well, yeah, because rock could be the Rolling Stones, or it could be King's X, or it could be, a lot of
Right,
different,
right.
like when you say rock, it's pretty vague, but it gives you an idea that it's not blues or country. It's so then you're interested in
Or
like,
disco,
or
the
disco.
worst.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
For a lot of the
although
heavy metal people in the late 70s. Yeah.
although Dynasty, right?
Oh,
That's a
right. Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Well, I mean, that says something about Kiss too, though, doesn't it? Willing to kind of
yes.
take on whatever happens to be catching at the time.
Although I did love Sure Know Something. That's a great tune. Um,
Yeah, and so this is going to be totally silly. Um, I was made for loving you. I think it's a good song.
right.
Um, my oldest kid, huge Kiss fan from like age 2 onward. And I remember when we would be driving and she would request that song. And the way she would do it is she called it the whip song, because there's that little bridge part where there's a cracking of a whip. you I guess that must have been the feature that stuck out the most at the time, a kid who's listening to it.
What's interesting is uh, a lot of women that hate Kiss, they love that song though.
Oh, interesting.
And
Yeah.
and I think it was played at Studio 54, which is interesting,
Yeah.
which was a disco club pretty much.
I mean, I'd have to look at the lyrics, but I can't think of anything that has some of the misogyny of like, come take a rocket ride, or things like that, right? So it makes sense that women would be
Oh
more
yeah, because
receptive
the
to that
word.
song. Yeah.
Yeah. I was made for loving you, were made for loving me. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, that's in some demographics, that's their biggest song.
Oh, interesting.
Where you and I would never say that's their biggest song, right?
No.
But
Yeah.
like Nadia is not a Kiss fan. She loves Paul Stanley though, but she loves that song.
Okay.
Like, wow, out of all the Kiss songs, you like that one? And like I have women friends that like love that song but don't like Kiss, and I'm like, well, there's something there, like it's the song that's not Kiss to me. It's like
Yeah.
yeah, it's like yeah, that the Dynasty album was them jumping on, like, so yeah, this willingness, you wouldn't call that a heavy metal album.
No, probably not. I mean, with Kiss, you can say they actually like used a lot of I'm not sure what the proper term for it is, but they're playing a song that is either, hard heavy rock or heavy metal, but they're using the basic kind of rhythmic structure. So like, boogie woogie, in some of the songs like Dr. Love, right?
Right.
Um, or using the ballad to do something like in Hard Luck Woman, No, that's probably not a metal song. Um, but they were pretty adept at using, and what do you call those? So I mean, so the Dynasty, they're using a disco shuffle beat and all of that.
Oh, they're just using that two bit like two beat do
Yeah.
um um, uh
But where the bass is coming in, I mean, Gene Simmons is playing differently on
right.
I Was Made for Loving You than he is on previous stuff or subsequent
Rock
stuff. Like
City.
Tears Are Falling would be,
Yeah,
a nice contrast, right?
yeah,
They're both
definitely.
romantic songs, but one is that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And I think, well, Van Halen was very good at doing that too. Taking a variety of different, maybe we'd call them like rhythmical structures, and then
yeah,
putting the other stuff over on top of that.
yeah. I mean, like Eddie always called "Hot for Teacher" like a ZZ Top on crack. Because he
Yeah,
was
I
just
can see that. That makes sense. Yeah,
and he loves ZZ Top, but yeah, I mean, like Al Waite is like the straight rock four on the floor drumming. But
yeah,
punk though is very different than that, right? Atomic punk is more
yeah,
that would be closer to metal. Yeah, I mean, it's what a great riff that is.
yeah,
But I don't know. I think you're onto something with the bands feeling like they don't want to be labeled at certain time unless it's
yeah,
advantageous. Like, hey, it's a metal. This is a big metal tour. Do you want to jump on? Yeah, we're heavy metal.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, I think it's hard. It's kind of like we always say. It's kind of you know it when you hear it. Although
mm,
now that we dig into it now, it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, I'll say this is heavy metal, but it's also lacking this or has elements of that. So is it heavy metal? Um,
I think it's useful too to have these sorts of like bounce ideas back and forth discussions because you might think, yeah, I know this. So this is heavy metal. This isn't.
right,
This is kind of questionable. But then you talk to somebody else who's been listening to this for decades and thinking about it, and then they'll point out something else and they'll be like, well, maybe this isn't metal because of this. And there's a factor that you hadn't taken into account before, you know?
right. I mean, with Sabbath, it was, I would say that the doom and gloom part of it makes it
Yeah. Yeah,
like
there's certain paradigm cases like that. Although, so there's an explanation for this. You could look at like Seventh Star and uh not the Ultimate Idol, the Eternal Idol, right? And you can be like, okay, it's kind of metal, maybe not, whereas like uh Born Again, definitely metal, right? The Dio era stuff, definitely
oh
metal.
yeah, 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 yeah.
um but those albums, and the reason is in part because Tony Iommi was being forced to use the Black Sabbath name. The record companies, he wanted it to be a solo stuff, in which case it probably would have been labeled as hard rock if it was like the Tony Iommi band, but it got placed into metal precisely. Well, it's a Sabbath album, so it's got to be
Right.
metal.
Although I would say Heaven and Hell is this the song. That's a
Oh no,
metal.
Dio era stuff I'd say is all metal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's almost like a metal anthem. But
Hmm.
the thing is, it's got that doom and gloom to it. It's a
Yeah,
slow
yeah.
gallop, and it's kind of like, in that middle section, those long chords, they're
Yep.
kind of gloomy. And I think with Sabbath, it wasn't that it was like loud and fast. It's that it had this characteristic of gloominess. That was,
Yeah.
and absolutely with Dio with that amazing voice. And yeah,
And I think you're right. And I would say that gloominess is missing on most of Seventh Star and Eternal Idol.
yeah,
I mean, there's some heavy stuff in there, but it doesn't have that.
right.
Uh,
Yeah, because like they were gloomy riffs like War Pigs. That's a
yeah.
gloomy tune.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So but it's metal for that reason. I don't know. I mean, it's this feeling you get from that. So that could be, we could call it gloomy metal.
That's right. And I mean, it leads to doom as a whole
Right.
genre, so.
Yeah.
Well, this is a good place, I think, to leave off for this session. Great conversation as always, and hopefully this will be of interest to viewers and listeners. We did ramble a bit, perhaps.
Interesting stuff, though.
Yeah. Any last words that you want to go out on, Scott?
No, I mean, but this is a topic um, that you could apply to any genre these days, right? Is it, like by the time the 70s hit with the jazz era, it was kind of like, they were yelling at Miles Davis for doing the kind of 45-minute like loud noise jams. Why aren't you playing My Funny Valentine anymore? Well, that's what records are for.
Yeah.
And is this jazz? Yeah, well,
Yeah, yeah.
and well, what makes it jazz? Well, improvisation. So people that jam are, so it's really something, especially now that so much music has happened, say since the 60s, where it was much easier to define.
Yeah.
Now it's a little harder. So maybe you have something after the word. Okay, it's this. Well, that's why we have subgenres of metal.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
So now it's like, but it still has to fit into one of those subgenres. If it's just flat out rock and roll, then no. But that's the bands that can teeter on that can go either way. I think is what we've discovered. I think that's something that we did kind of,
Yeah, that's a good takeaway. Yeah.
yeah, it's a good takeaway is that we, okay, these bands for the reasons we outlined are kind of on the cusp and could go either way where the first four Metallica albums they can't say well we're a rock and roll band.
Yeah, I mean, if they did, we wouldn't believe them.
We wouldn't believe them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah,
Okay.
that's all I have.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it.